The vast command chamber of the Zerath Dominion's flagship pulsed with eerie bioluminescence. Grand Strategist V.A. Zurich stood at the helm, his four elongated fingers resting against the control panel as he examined the shimmering holographic display of Earth. A blue-green world, teeming with organic life, its surface marred by dense urban clusters and thinly spread military outposts. It was an open wound, waiting to be cauterized. Their civilization is primitive, a subordinate droned, the Zerath officer's elongated skull tilting slightly. Their weapons rely on chemical-based ballistics, their starships barely breach their own orbit, and their command structures are fractured by political infighting. V.A. Zurich exhaled in amusement, the slits on his neck flaring. It was always the same with lesser species. Arrogance had served the Dominion well. Across 100 campaigns, they had crushed civilizations far more advanced than this one. Humanity would not even pose a challenge. He turned away from the display and made his decision. Deploy the vanguard, conquer their capital cities, reduce their military to ash, and issue terms of surrender. If they resist, exterminate them. The invasion began with fire. The skies darkened as Zerath warships broke through the upper atmosphere, their descent marked by searing blue contrails. Energy beams lanced downward, striking military installations before human forces could mobilize. Cities crumbled, their glass towers melting under the alien onslaught. Reports of global devastation flooded every remaining human communications channel. Nations fell in hours, in a hardened command bunker beneath the Nevada desert. Colonel Jack Reynolds listened to the panic transmissions coming in from what remained of the world's military. The United Nations had already signaled its intent to surrender, and resistance efforts were being crushed before they could even take form. He gritted his teeth as he leaned over the dimly lit operations table, his rough fingers tracing the glowing red, indicators that marked every fallen stronghold. His second-in-command, Sergeant Nathan Briggs, paced beside him. A man built for war, with a squared jaw and deep-set eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent on battlefields, he had seen the impossible before. But never on this scale. They're hitting everything at once, Briggs muttered, rubbing his temple. I don't care how advanced they are. Nobody has that much firepower to burn the entire planet in a day. Jack nodded, which means they're overextending. He tapped the map. They think we'll surrender. They think a few precise strikes will make us roll over. They're not wrong, Lieutenant Kyle Mercer said, arms crossed. Younger than the others, but sharp as a razor. Mercer had an instinct for predicting enemy movement. The government's already waving the white flag. Some of our own people are too shocked to fight back. Jack exhaled slowly, weighing the grim reality against his gut instinct. He had served in countless war zones, seen entire regions turned to ruin by overwhelming force, but he had never once believed in surrender. The Zerath had made one critical mistake. They think we fight like they do. He straightened, locking eyes with both men. They don't understand what we're capable of. A tremor ran through the ground as distant impacts sent shockwaves through the earth. The main command screen flickered, revealing aerial footage of the Zerath forces advancing through the ruins of Los Angeles. Enormous biomechanical war beasts, their bodies a fusion of organic sinew and metallic plating, crushed abandoned vehicles underfoot as they marched alongside towering infantry in sleek exoskeletal armor. It was an overwhelming force, but Jack saw the gaps in their formation. Their reliance on centralized command structures, their expectation of swift surrender. He turned back to Briggs and Mercer, his expression grim but determined. Get everyone we have left. We're going dark, no transmissions, no open movements. We're not fighting a conventional war anymore. Briggs nodded. Guerrilla? Guerrilla, Jack confirmed. We fight from the shadows. We bleed them. And we show them that humanity doesn't break. Mercer allowed himself a half-smirk. We're gonna need a hell of a plan. Jack glanced back at the flickering screen, at the alien war machines moving unchallenged through once thriving human cities. A war was coming, but it wouldn't be the war the Zerath expected. It would be the kind of war that made legends. The desert night stretched endlessly, the cold air sharp against Colonel Jack Reynolds' skin as he crouched behind the jagged remains of a collapsed overpass. In the distance, the ruins of Denver flickered with scattered fires, casting eerie shadows over the twisted metal skeletons of buildings that had once stood proud. The Zayrath controlled the city now, patrolling its streets with their biomechanical war beasts and energy-clad infantry, confident that humanity had been broken. They were wrong. Jack lowered his binoculars, turning to the men crouched beside him. Sergeant Nathan Briggs rested a heavy-caliber sniper rifle against his knee, his expression hardened into something unreadable. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer checked his wrist display, watching as the last of their scattered units signaled readiness. "This is it," Jack murmured. "Our first real counterstrike." Mercer's voice was steady, but a flicker of anticipation danced in his eyes. "You really think we can pull this off?" Jack didn't answer immediately. The plan was reckless, born out of desperation and necessity, but the alternative was extinction. The Zayrath had deployed a command relay in the heart of the city, a towering construct of pulsating alien metal that served as their central node for communications and logistics. Destroying it wouldn't just cripple their local forces, it would send a message. Briggs chambered around with a slow, deliberate motion. "I say we make him bleed." Jack glanced at his watch. 2 minutes until go time. The distant wail of a Zayrath patrol drifted through the broken streets, their guttural language distorted through alien helmets. He signaled for silence. Shadows moved between the crumbling structures. His men, survivors from shattered battalions, special operations teams that had refused to surrender, even a handful of civilian resistance fighters who had learned quickly that staying hidden meant staying alive. As the timer reached 0, the first explosion erupted. A fuel depot on the outskirts of the city detonated in a pillar of flame, sending a shockwave rippling through the urban ruins. The Zayrath response was immediate. Sirens wailed in their strange, warbling tones, and their forces began mobilizing toward the perceived attack site. Exactly as planned. Jack tapped his radio twice. From the rooftops, suppressed gunfire cracked as snipers took down key targets, the Zayrath infantry dropping before they even realized they were under attack. At street level, small squads emerged from the rubble, moving with lethal precision, grenades lobbed into unsuspecting patrols, silenced weapons dispatching lone scouts before they could sound an alarm. The confusion spread like wildfire. Mercer's team led the charge toward the command relay, weaving through alleyways and abandoned storefronts. He moved like a ghost, his squad behind him, their rifles outfitted with scavenged alien tech. Experimental coil guns that sent blue arcs of energy into their targets, bypassing even Zayrath armor. Briggs had taken position in a collapsed office tower, his sniper rifle aimed at the enemy command post. He steadied his breath, waiting for the exact moment the first Zayrath officer stepped into view. One shot. The officer's skull split apart in a flash of blue mist, his lifeless body crumpling. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks. The air filled with the sharp, unnatural screeches of the war beasts as they turned their attention toward the unseen attackers. Jack led the final push. His men swarmed the perimeter, planting charges along the base of the towering relay. Plasma fire scorched the air, forcing them into cover as Zayrath reinforcements arrived in force. The enemy had finally realized this wasn't a random skirmish. Mercer's voice crackled over comms. "We've got heavy infantry inbound. They're bringing out the walkers." Jack grit his teeth. The Zayrath walkers were armored quadrupeds, their plating impervious to small arms fire. One direct hit from their energy cannons could turn an entire squad to ash. Briggs took his shot. The armor-piercing round slammed into the exposed joint of the nearest walker, sending it crashing sideways into a building. It screeched, struggling to rise, but before it could, a well-placed rocket from one of Jack's men finished the job. The explosion lit up the street, raining molten debris onto the battlefield. But the Zayrath kept coming. More war beasts, more infantry, more firepower than the dwindling human forces could withstand. Jack checked the charges, 30 seconds left. "Fall back," he ordered. His men peeled away from the relay, firing as they retreated. The Zayrath pushed forward, unaware of what was coming. 10 seconds. Jack reached cover just as the charges detonated. The explosion shattered the night, a shockwave tearing through the city as the command relay crumbled in on itself. A surge of blue energy rippled outward, frying every Zayrath system in its radius. Their forces staggered, their movements faltering as their communications blacked out. Briggs let out a low whistle. Damn fine fireworks. Jack didn't smile. This was only the beginning. The Zayrath had underestimated them once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The sky above the Rocky Mountains was a bruised shade of violet, the last remnants of dusk fading behind jagged peaks. Colonel Jack Reynolds stood at the edge of the hidden command post, his eyes scanning the valley below where the remains of the U.S. Army had gathered. What had once been a fractured network of scattered resistance cells was now something far deadlier, a force tempered by fire, fueled by vengeance, and prepared to strike back. Their last assault had proven one thing. The Zayrath were not invincible. Their forces relied on rigid command structures, their technology, though superior, was vulnerable to human ingenuity, and above all, they had no experience fighting an enemy that refused to break. The destruction of the Denver Command Relay had sent shockwaves through the alien ranks, severing communications across the region and stalling their advance. For the first time since the invasion began, the Zayrath had stopped expanding. That hesitation was all Jack needed. Behind him, Lieutenant Kyle Mercer approached, a tablet in hand. His face was illuminated by the flickering glow of tactical data feeding real-time updates from across the country. "We've pinpointed the location of their primary energy grid," he said, holding up the screen. "A subterranean facility outside of Kansas City. If we take it out, their war beasts go dark, their walkers stop moving, and their orbital cannons go blind." Jack exhaled, considering the implications. If they pulled this off, it wouldn't just cripple the Zayrath's operations, it would force them onto the defensive. Sergeant Nathan Briggs appeared beside them, chewing a strip of jerky with the casual ease of a man who had walked through hell and came out grinning. "Sounds like a suicide mission," he said, swallowing. "When do we leave?" Jack glanced between them. "We move at dawn." The convoy rolled out just before sunrise, a column of armored vehicles weaving through the mountain roads. The remnants of the 3rd Armored Division led the charge, surviving Abrams tanks, retrofitted with scavenged Zayrath plating, their cannons loaded with depleted uranium rounds capable of punching through alien hulls. Behind them, a fleet of up-armor Humvees carried infantry, each soldier equipped with salvaged coil guns and modified rail rifles. The army that had once been shattered was now reborn, faster, deadlier, and unrelenting. By the time they reached the outskirts of Kansas City, the first signs of the enemy came into view. The Zayrath had fortified the facility, surrounding it with defensive towers that pulsed with ominous blue energy. Walker patrols moved in careful formation, scanning the horizon with glowing red visors. Mercer crouched behind the remains of a collapsed overpass, adjusting the settings on his rifle. Their outer defenses are linked to an automated response system. If we hit them head-on, we'll be swarmed before we get within 100 yards of the entrance. Jack studied the terrain, weighing their options. Then we don't hit them head-on. Briggs smirked. "I like where this is going." Under the cover of darkness, they split into 3 teams. Mercer led a strike unit around the facility's perimeter, planting EMP charges at key relay points. Briggs took a sniper team to high ground, providing overwatch while preparing to neutralize priority targets. Jack, leading the main assault force, waited for the signal. The first explosion was a burst of white energy as the EMP charges detonated, sending arcs of blue lightning through the Zayrath defenses. The automated turrets flickered, their targeting systems momentarily scrambled. It was all the opening they needed. "Go!" Jack ordered. The tanks roared forward, their cannons unleashing hell. The first shell struck the nearest defensive tower, reducing it to a smoldering ruin. Infantry poured into the breach, their weapons blazing as they cut through disoriented Zayrath soldiers. From above, Briggs' rifle cracked. A Zayrath warlord, twice the size of a human, collapsed mid-command, his armored frame hitting the ground with a metallic clang. His death sent a ripple of confusion through the enemy ranks. Mercer's team reached the facility's entrance, breaching the doors with controlled explosives. The underground complex was a maze of alien machinery, pulsating conduits stretching deep into the earth. They moved fast, planting charges at critical points. Outside, the battle raged. A Zayrath walker lumbered forward, its energy cannon charging, but before it could fire, a shoulder-launched missile struck its side, sending it crashing into a burning wreck. Jack's radio crackled. Charges set, Mercer reported. 30 seconds until detonation. Fall back, Jack ordered. His men peeled away from the battlefield, covering each other as they retreated. The Zayrath, realizing too late what was happening, scrambled to stop them. Energy bolts scorched the air, but the humans had already escaped into the shadows. The ground trembled. Then the facility erupted. A column of blue fire shot into the sky, the shockwave flattening everything in its radius. The Zayrath warbeasts convulsed, their biomechanical forms seizing as their energy cores flickered and died. Walkers collapsed mid-stride, their limbs locking up as power drained from their systems. The orbital cannons above Earth's atmosphere sputtered, their targeting arrays going dark. The Zayrath's technological advantage had just been erased. Briggs let out a low chuckle. Well, I'll be damned. Jack watched the fires burn, his expression unreadable. The war was far from over. But for the first time, humanity wasn't just surviving. They were winning. The ruins of Washington, D.C. smoldered beneath a storm-choked sky. Blackened husks of buildings stood as silent witnesses to the destruction that had swept the capital. The Zayrath flagship hovered above the shattered city like a vengeful god, its sleek, chitinous hull pulsating with an eerie blue glow. This was where it would end. Colonel Jack Reynolds crouched behind the wreckage of a downed helicopter, the acrid scent of burning metal thick in his lungs. His rifle was warm against his shoulder, its grip worn smooth from months of battle. The final assault was about to begin. The last of Earth's forces had gathered. What remained of the U.S. Army, scattered NATO remnants, and civilian fighters who had refused to surrender? They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, but they had one thing the Zayrath didn't: desperation. Sergeant Nathan Briggs knelt beside him, adjusting the sights on his sniper rifle. His face was smeared with grime, his knuckles bruised and bloodied, but his eyes burned with determination. "Looks like they finally stopped underestimating us," he muttered, nodding toward the massive force assembling outside the ruins of the White House. Zayrath warbeasts lined the streets, hulking, grotesque fusions of flesh and metal, their elongated limbs tipped with plasma-forged claws. Squads of armored infantry marched in perfect formation, their weapons humming with barely restrained energy. Overhead, drone swarms hovered like a living storm, ready to rain death on anything that moved. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer crawled up beside them, his tablet flickering with intercepted enemy transmissions. "They know this is it," he said. "Their supreme strategist, V.A. Zirek, is on board that flagship. If we take him out, their entire war effort collapses." Jack exhaled slowly. "Then we finish this." A single radio click signaled the attack. The first explosion tore through the Zayrath's front line, a wall of fire consuming their infantry in an instant. Rockets screamed from hidden launchers, slamming into the towering warbeasts, sending their twisted forms toppling into the rubble. From the ruins, human soldiers surged forward, their rifles flashing in the darkness, coil guns spitting blue streaks of energy. Briggs took his first shot. A Zayrath officer's head snapped back in a mist of alien blood. Another fell before he could react. The enemy faltered, confused. They had expected a desperate last stand, not a coordinated assault. Jack led the charge through the wreckage of Pennsylvania Avenue, his boots pounding against the cracked pavement. Gunfire roared on all sides. Plasma bolts seared past his head, close enough to feel their heat. He ducked behind an overturned tank, returning fire, his shots punching through Zayrath armor. Mercer's team had already infiltrated the remains of the Pentagon, using underground tunnels to flank the enemy. They emerged like ghosts, cutting down Zerath soldiers with brutal efficiency. "We're in position," Mercer's voice crackled over the radio. "We'll clear the way to the dropship." At the heart of the battlefield, the flagship's landing bay began to open. A towering figure descended, a Zerath warlord encased in obsidian armor, his 4 arms gripping a plasma blade as long as a man. Supreme Strategist V.A. Zirek had come to end the resistance himself. Jack locked eyes with him. The alien's gaze was filled with something Jack had never seen from a Zerath before. Rage. V.A. Zirek raised a clawed hand. The Zerath forces regrouped, their lines tightening. A new wave of war beasts emerged, their reinforced plating resistant to small arms fire. Jack clenched his jaw. "Briggs, drop him." Briggs steadied his aim. The shot rang out. V.A. Zirek moved faster than anything that size should have. The bullet missed by inches, ricocheting off his armor. The warlord turned his gaze toward the sniper's position and raised his blade. A beam of pure energy lanced upward, engulfing the building Briggs had perched on. Jack's stomach twisted. "Briggs!" The radio crackled. "Still here?" Briggs grunted, his voice strained. "But I think that bastard just ruined my day." V.A. Zirek strode forward, his massive form cutting through the battlefield. Human soldiers fell before him, their weapons ineffective against his armor. Jack gritted his teeth. They couldn't win this fight, conventionally, but they didn't need to. "Mercer, get to the flagship," Jack ordered. "Blow that thing to hell." "Already on it," Mercer replied. His team sprinted through the chaos, using the confusion to slip past the Zerath lines. Jack turned his attention back to V.A. Zirek. The warlord was coming for him. "Cover me," Jack ordered, rising from cover. He sprinted toward the alien, firing as he moved. The bullets sparked uselessly off V.A. Zirek's armor, but he wasn't aiming to kill. He was drawing him in. The warlord snarled, swinging his blade in a wide arc. Jack barely dodged, rolling beneath the strike and coming up behind him. He yanked a grenade from his belt and slammed it against V.A. Zirek's back, the adhesive charge sticking to the armor seam. He dove away. The explosion sent the warlord staggering, his armor cracked, but he was still standing. "Persistent bastard," Briggs muttered, lining up another shot. This time, the bullet struck home, piercing the exposed wound. V.A. Zirek roared in fury, his movements faltering. Jack didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, aiming for the crack in the armor. One final shot. The bullet struck true. V.A. Zirek stumbled, his massive form swaying before collapsing onto the shattered pavement. A ripple of shock spread through the remaining Zerath forces. Their leader was dead. Then the sky lit up. The flagship's core detonated. Mercer's team had succeeded. The explosion consumed the massive vessel, raining molten debris over the battlefield. The remaining Zerath forces, leaderless and disoriented, began to fall back. The tide had turned. Jack exhaled, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, it was humanity that stood victorious. The fires of Washington, D.C. burned long into the night, casting flickering shadows over the ruins of a world forever changed. The once mighty Zerath, conquerors of 100 worlds, had been broken. Their flagship lay in twisted wreckage, its blackened husk smoldering in the heart of the shattered city. Across the battlefield, alien corpses lay strewn among the bodies of fallen human soldiers, a grim testament to the price of victory. Colonel Jack Reynolds stood atop a crumbling monument, overlooking the ruins where the last battle had been fought. The wind carried the scent of smoke and blood, the distant echoes of gunfire now replaced by the murmurs of survivors tending to the wounded. He clenched his fists, exhaustion settling into his bones. They had won, but at what cost? Footsteps crunched over shattered pavement behind him. Sergeant Nathan Briggs, his face streaked with grime and blood, limped forward, favoring his left leg. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Hell of a fight," he muttered. Jack nodded, his gaze locked on the distant horizon. The war had lasted 2 years. 2 years of relentless slaughter, of cities turned to ash, of entire continents falling under the alien heel. Yet now, the unthinkable had happened. Earth had survived. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer approached, his uniform torn but his eyes still sharp. "We're getting reports from around the world," he said. "The Zayrath forces are in full retreat. Whatever leadership they had left is scattering. They're abandoning their ground forces, trying to regroup in orbit." Jack didn't smile. "And we let them?" Mercer's jaw tightened. "We don't have the ships to chase them. Not yet." Briggs let out a short laugh. "Give us a few months. We'll find a way." The truth was, Earth had been a backwater planet before the invasion. No interstellar fleets, no planetary defenses, just a fractured world of warring nations that had been forced to unite under the shadow of annihilation. The Zayrath had expected an easy conquest. Instead, they had met something they could never understand: defiance. Jack turned, looking over the remnants of his army. These were men who had lost everything: families, homes, entire histories wiped clean. And yet they had fought on. Not because they were stronger, not because they were better armed, but because they refused to kneel. "They thought we were weak," Jack murmured. Briggs smirked. "Guess we showed him." Above them, the night sky shimmered with wreckage from the destroyed Zayrath fleet, a cosmic graveyard stretching across the heavens. And beyond that, the vast unknown of space, the empire that had sent the Zayrath here in the first place. Jack knew the truth. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Mercer sighed, rubbing his temples. "Command's asking for you. Apparently, the whole world wants to know what happens next." Jack took one last look at the ruins before turning away. The battle for Earth was won. But humanity's story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Somewhere, out there in the dark, the rest of the Zayrath Empire was waiting, and this time, Earth wouldn't be the ones caught off guard. The legend had already begun. A species that had never stepped beyond their own moon had stood against one of the most feared armies in the galaxy and survived. Stories would spread. Other worlds under Zayrath rule would hear whispers of a blue planet that had refused to bow, of warriors who had fought with nothing but grit and fire in their hearts. Humanity had been underestimated once. It would never happen again.